morning, brothers and sisters. This is an article from RaptureReady.com called The Day of the Lord in relation to the pre-trib rapture. This author gives really good examples of how the rapture relates to the day of the Lord. After detailing the rapture in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul continues his admonition into chapter 5, focusing on the times and the epochs. The day of the Lord is said to come upon the world like a thief in the night. On the contrary, believers will not be caught off guard. Why not? Because they will be taken to safety in the rapture that Paul discussed earlier. Paul wrote, "You have no need of anything to be written to you," because he had already taught the pre-tribulation rapture. Paul likely borrowed his thief terminology from Jesus in Matthew 24, verse 43. There, Jesus likened his coming to an unannounced arrival of a thief. The question in this discussion is, was Jesus referring to his second coming at the end of the tribulation or to the rapture of the church before the tribulation? Well, let's look at the olivet discourse. In Matthew 24, Jesus' disciples admire the second temple. Unmoved by their excitement, Jesus predicts the temple's destruction. The disciples then ask Jesus two specific questions. First, they ask him, "When will these things happen?" Second, they ask, "What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Now in verses 4 through 14, Christ answers the second question, surveying the entire 7-year tribulation, which concludes with the second coming in verses 29 through 31. Jesus reveals many signs that will signal the nearness of his return at the end of the tribulation, culminating at verse 14. These signs are false messiahs, wars and rumors of wars, nation against nations, famines, pestilences, and earthquakes. These are all identified as the beginnings of sorrows, because they are merely the initial judgments of the tribulation. In verse 15, Jesus gives his listeners the super sign of the end, the abomination of desolation. Returns the reader to the midpoint of the tribulation when the Antichrist enthrones himself in the Jerusalem temple. In verse 21, Jesus designates this time as the Great Tribulation because its severity will be unmatched in all human history. The Great Tribulation intensifies up to the second coming of Christ in verses 29 through 31. The parable of the fig tree teaches that the convergence of all the signs will inform the terminal generation that Christ's return is at hand. In verse 36, however, a transition is observed, now concerning. This takes the reader back to the first of the two questions the disciples asked, "When will these things happen?" Jesus transitions from describing events that will characterize those days to surveying that day. The transition also marks a significant shift in Jesus' early emphasis on what people can know via the signs of his return in those days to the mysterious surprise return of Christ on that day. Jesus' analogy to the days of Noah described the business-as-usual mindset that characterizes the world before the flood. Apparently, this same unsuspecting mindset will once again be commonplace in the days leading up to that day, when the result that day will catch the world by surprise. The question is, which day? It can only be the day of the Lord and the accompanying rapture of the church. So is Matthew 24, verse 36, a rapture passage? A seeming contradiction must be resolved. All post-tribulationists and many pre-tribulationists, compelled by context, interpret Matthew 24 as referring to the same event outlined in verses 21 through 31, the return of Christ in power and glory immediately after the tribulation of those days. Many of them do not observe the slight shift in focus from those days to that day. Are verses 36 through 44 really describing the post-tribulation return of Christ? Jesus said in Matthew 24:39 that people did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Is it possible during the Great Tribulation that men will not understand what is happening precisely when God's judgments are poured out in all their intensity? Now, Charles Ryrie states that when the Great Tribulation comes, men will act as if they think the world is coming to an end. 1/4 of the earth's population is wiped out in the 4th seal judgment alone. At the 6th seal judgment, all men recognize that God's wrath has come, and they attempt to hide from it. The event of verses 36 through 44 occurs during a time of relative peace, when a business as usual mindset still characterizes the world. This mindset is incompatible with the conditions on earth during the Great Tribulation. Concerning the Great Tribulation in Daniel 12, the description of the time of the end confirms Daniel's revelation that the time of the end will be a period of trouble such as the world has never known. Trouble of such character that it would result in the extermination of the human race if it were not cut short by the consummation, the second coming. The event of Matthew 24, verse 36 must be understood as occurring immediately before the tribulation begins. So a distinction must be made. The rapture does not begin the 7-year tribulation. According to Daniel 9:27, the confirmation of a 7-year covenant between Israel and the Antichrist does. It has been increasingly common to identify a time gap between the rapture and the confirmation of this covenant. There could be a gap, but it is unlikely to be a significant one because the primary purpose of the rapture is to remove the church from the world before God's wrath begins. The tension in the olivet discourse between what the disciples can know and what they cannot know can only be reconciled by recognizing that Jesus references 2 distinct periods: the days leading up to his second coming, verses 4 through 32, and the time just before the rapture, verses 36 through 44. Now, an objection is raised that because the Olivet Discourse is for Israel, it therefore cannot allude to the rapture of the church. Jesus, however, is answering his disciples' question: when will these things happen? Jesus answers this question by teaching that the day of the Lord will catch the world by complete surprise, and not even his believers will know the day in advance. Matthew 24 is not particularly concerned with the rapture, but with the state of the world just before Daniel's 70th week. Only then will a routine, business-as-usual mindset characterize the world. Then suddenly and without warning, a cataclysmic and signless event will catch the entire world by complete surprise and plunge it into a time of devastating judgment. This is the most literal interpretation of the thief in the night language that Jesus and Paul employ. A thief never provides signs that announce his arrival at night. He relies on the element of surprise. In the same way, the unexpected arrival of Jesus Christ in the clouds before the tribulation will be signless. The admonition to the believer is to always be ready. The warning to the non-believer is that at any moment he or she may be left to face Daniel's 70th week. When Paul wrote to the Thessalonians about the rapture, he commanded them to comfort one another with these words: "No greater comfort exists than the expectation of the imminent rapture of the church prior to the tribulation." Paul borrowed his thief in the night imagery from Jesus, who employed it in describing the conditions of the world prior to the tribulation, not the second coming. Pre-tribulationists, using the grammatical historical method of interpretation, can teach that Jesus Christ will come for his church before the tribulation as a thief in the night. Now, to add some additional thoughts to the excerpt of that particular article, a lot of people have a hard time reconciling that Jesus would say that up until the second coming, it would be the days as it was in the days of Noah, where people would be eating and drinking and carrying on as usual. Because the rapture happens before the day of the Lord, and we know the day of the Lord is essentially the 7-year tribulation period, when God comes and visits mankind through his wrath. And we know that the church is not destined for wrath. So I think he gives some pretty good examples using the olivet discourse, explaining why these signs that are talked about in the olivet discourse are really just talking about the signs leading up to the rapture of the church and ultimately to the day of the Lord, not particularly the second coming. I've heard a lot of other commentators say that the wicked will not know the day or the hour because they'll be so steeped in their wickedness, and the world will be caught by surprise by the second coming. I have a hard time believing that regarding what it says in Revelation and the amount of judgment and the amount of death and the depopulation of the earth happening in that time period. I mean, as wicked as people are, they would still have to know that the end of mankind is near. So again, I think he gives some pretty good points, and we can always agree to disagree on what he says, but I wanted to present this information and this view. God bless.